All right. I would like to welcome you to the SciTech lecture this afternoon. SciTech is a partnership between the Math Science and Technology Division here at Forsyth Tech and the National Center for the Biotechnology Workforce. We have a 10-year history of having these SciTech lectures, and we have had over 60 speakers to date that have been here to share their knowledge and expertise about science, technology, and workforce. To date, we have had over 3,400 students, faculty, staff, and community members come and view our SciTech lectures. And we're happy to see you all here today so we can add to that number. Okay. If you wish to view these lectures later on or show them to your class or coworkers, these lectures are being recorded and broadcast live at the moment, thanks to our Center for Transformative Learning. If you'd like to view these videos, you can go to YouTube. They are also on the biotechworkforce.org website as well. So it is my pleasure to introduce Nancy Johnston, who is the Regional Executive Director for the North Carolina Biotechnology Center, and she is going to introduce our speaker for this afternoon.
Hey, good afternoon. I am so excited that, Russ, you asked once again to give me the privilege of representing not only the North Carolina Biotechnology Center, but the great work that's being done at the National Center for the Biotechnology Workforce and here at Forsyth Tech. So today, you're going to hear from a transformational leader. You truly, truly are. And I will tell you that I was speaking to some students at Winston-Salem State University last week. It was an entrepreneurial biology class. And I was expressing to them the importance in the life sciences of knowing your why and knowing your how and what problem you wanted to solve and how you were going to solve that. And I also talked to these students about the importance of having the courage and the commitment and really the energy and persistence and focus to get it done. And I think Jennifer Byrne embodies a lot of that with what she's going to share today. I do want to let you know that she wears a lot of hats, but she's representing today her role as the CEO of Javara Research and also as the founder of the Greater Gift Initiative. So Jennifer is a devoted, innovative leader. She's actively involved in local, regional, and statewide community. She's actually on the Center Watch Top 20 Innovators list, right here in Winston-Salem, in the Piedmont Triad in North Carolina, so we're very proud. She's a natural collaborator. She's very proactive. She's energetic. She's inspirational. She really supports women in STEM and all those in STEM. She knows the importance of the work that she's doing. She's an important contributor to finding solutions to what we try to focus on at the Biotech Center, and that is trying to heal the world as a global life sciences leader. And she's been very successful in building her new organization, Javara, that employs, I believe, 20 talented people with projections to expand nationally to employ nearly 2,000. So you really are going to want to listen to the transformational leadership that she's bringing to the thinking around clinical research. And I'm just honored to have her serve as an advisory committee member, along with Russ Reed and others. And I just want to welcome her to the podium. So if you'll join me. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Where to even begin? Just a little bit of background about myself. And I think as a starting point, I'm actually here to focus on the 21st century in clinical trials, but I can tell you I actually go back to the 20th century in the beginning of my journey. So just a little bit of background about me. First of all, I'm really grateful to be here. Thank you for your time today and your interest. And hopefully you will leave here just even a little more informed, and even if it means that you move to action in even a little or a big way. That's really what it's all about. But just by way of a little bit of background, I actually, coming through the doors here today, was kind of a blast to the past. While I didn't go to Forsyth Tech right out of high school, I actually went to a community college in Texas and found that that was just a wonderful experience, because coming out of college, I had a lot of hopes and dreams. I can't say that I had a lot of clearly defined direction in that, and so my time at the community college was just really a great entry point. So very grateful for this community college in our community and kind of across the nation. I think it's a real sometimes hidden gem. So by way of background, I was watching something last night, and it was kind of like what not to do in presentation. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in terms of my background and my resume, but I will tell you, just as far as kind of stepping stones, just a little bit about my past. When I think about career progression, which I'm assuming that everybody in this room has some root of interest, whether you're considering career progression or personal, your own personal journey and kind of how you're threading your story and you're progressing. Where that began for me, I've had a lot of different jobs that I think have led me to this moment in time, and even thinking about in the years past, everything's been a stepping stone. So by way of background, I would say I started out as a teacher. When I was about 6 years old, I had a 2-year-old brother, and I was able to hold him captive down in the basement with my chalkboard, and I was able to teach him. So I, first of all, was teacher. I had a newspaper route, and that really taught me the importance of customer service and the importance sometimes, what might seem like a little thing, having your newspaper. And I talked about a newspaper route not long ago, and somebody asked for a show of hands, and so about half of the people in the room didn't even know what a newspaper route was, but hopefully most of you do. You know, my newspaper route really did. It taught me a lot about customer service. It taught me about discipline. I had to get up in the morning at 5 o'clock when nobody else was up, and there was something, it was an important function. Might not have seemed that way to the outside world. I think some of my friends thought that, you know, that was just the worst job in the world, but yet it was a really important point. I worked in retail. I worked in the food service industry. I was a phlebotomist, and I had many aspirations of being a doctor. Not so much the doctor part, but there was something about that hospital experience. My mother was a nurse. That was an environment that I knew that I felt good in, and it felt like I was doing something that was a little beyond myself. So that's just, and I share all of those things with you because a lot of those continue to be important elements to me that I've kind of have taken and applied. Really enough about kind of my background, but as far as journey and connecting to clinical research, I went to college. I went to Texas A&M. I graduated with a degree in nutrition. I felt pretty confident that I didn't want to do clinical dietetics, but when I really looked at the curriculum, there were a lot of the classes that I just found interested me. By contrast from where I started, which was in biochemistry, and a lot of those courses didn't really excite me. But there was something about the curriculum, and so I went on to actually graduate with a degree in nutrition. I had no real idea of what it was that I wanted to do. And like so many clinical research professionals today, I was just at a national meeting yesterday with 1,700 professionals, and I'm sure if there would have been a survey, at least half of the people at this meeting would have shared very much a very similar story. No real idea about the profession of clinical research. You come out of school, you finish your program, somehow or another. Still today, people who fall into clinical research do just that. So I fell into this opportunity to have my first clinical research position. That was in 1986, and I really didn't know what that job meant for me. I will tell you that a month into the job, I really felt like I was home. There were so many elements of that job that, again, just a couple of months before, I knew nothing about. There was nobody really in my circle that had been involved in clinical research, but there were so many aspects of what I had described to you before from all my jobs leading up to that, that actually felt like a really good fit. So, just to give you a little bit of kind of framework as far as change and evolution in clinical trials, we'll talk a little bit about some of what I consider to be kind of universal truths, those things about this field that I believe will never change, and then we'll talk a lot about things today that we're very much in the midst of changing. So just to kind of level set, I guess, with respect to the audience, how many in this in the room right now are involved in the clinical research program here currently? Okay. All right, good. Then my slides are going to be good, because I was afraid that there were too many people here who had a really clear-cut path on the whole kind of spectrum of clinical research. So I'm going to give you kind of the ABCs of clinical research. So right now today, there are about 7,000 drugs and devices that are in the pipeline from a global standpoint. So you have major pharmaceutical companies, you have small biotech companies, you have technology companies that in some cases are developing some of these products. It's a wide array. And every single year, the speed at which the diversity of these products is changing is almost head-spinning. So lots and lots of drugs and devices that are in the pipeline. As far as kind of an overview of the process of clinical research, first of all, I guess, why? Why do we have clinical research? It's a very stringent process, and I'll talk about some of those elements to it. But this is a process that every single drug that you've ever taken, whether it's been prescribed by your physician or it's been something that you've been off the shelf, that you've bought off the shelf, or it is a digital thermometer, has been through this process, okay? So just to kind of give you the big view of this, there are different stages of really the drug development or the device development pipeline. We're going to be focused today, or my conversation, where my focus has been on the clinical side. There is a preclinical portion to this, whereby drugs are developed or devices are developed in a laboratory, and years can go by and a lot of dollars and a lot of smart people, and then at some point the drug actually progresses into animal trials. So that's all really referred to as preclinical. Clinical research is actually where the Food and Drug Administration gets involved. And so there is a certain amount of data that must be collected that substantiates, from an FDA standpoint, a reasonable, it would be reasonable from a scientific and a patient safety standpoint to actually begin to introduce this compound or this device into human subjects. That really is the beginning of what's called phase 1. Now, for every 10,000 new compounds or devices that are developed, beginning basically in a laboratory on the bench, one will eventually make it to the marketplace. So the attrition is enormous. There's an enormous amount of work that goes behind this. Progressing to in-human clinical trials, the initial first-time-in-man trials are called phase 1. Some phase 1 trials are conducted right here in our own city. From time to time, Wake Forest might be involved in phase 1 trials. My former company, PMG Research, which is headquartered here, on occasion over the years, we would do a handful of phase 1 trials. Phase 1 trials are first time in man. They're very small trials. It might be that over the course of an entire phase 1 project, there might only be 60 people who have actually been exposed to that through a series of different trials. Trials would be like a lab experiment, if you think of that, a very specific lab experiment defining a very specific type of patient population with very prescribed events that are happening during that time. So it's a very regimented process. I think that's another thing that really drew me to clinical research. If you are a very detailed person, this is a good field for you because there's a lot of detail that goes into this. So through phase 1, you progress into phase 2 trials. I would say that from a community standpoint, if you've seen newspaper advertisements, if you've had a doctor who has approached you about participating in a clinical trial, more than likely, my guess would be those trials would be phase 2 or phase 3. Phase 2 trials, really, it's a series of individual studies that are happening. These studies are happening not only in the United States, they're happening, generally speaking, from a global standpoint. So in phase 2 trials, you have a handful of different research sites and centers, whether they're academic medical centers, whether they're freestanding research centers, whether they're doctors' offices, a lot of different kind of business models around where clinical trials can be conducted. Generally speaking, phase 2 might involve some number of hundreds of patients over a series of these trials. And during phase 2, what's really being established from a data standpoint is looking at safety. So there aren't many elements in terms of establishing how effective the drug is. It's focused on safety. You are starting to look at target populations. So just backing up a little bit, in phase 1 studies, just for clarification, phase 1 studies are usually normal, healthy volunteers who don't necessarily have, if it's a diabetic drug, for example, it's usually not a diabetic patient population. In phase 2, there's still a lot of emphasis on safety, but you are starting to look basically at the target population. Phase 3 trials expand. Generally speaking, in phase 3 trials, there might well be thousands of patients. My company right now, we're involved in a phase 3 trial. There are 17,000 that will be included in that particular trial. It's a heart failure trial. So phase 3, much larger, more complex, more of the drug development cost is probably going in phase 3. And then at some point in time, over all of these years, the FDA reviews the application from the pharmaceutical company, and there's a go or no go. Now, usually it's not that absolute. It's not that there's no FDA involvement, no FDA oversight until this process. It's an ongoing, very kind of iterative process. But at some point in time, when there's sufficient data that really answers the question, kind of the big question for FDA, is this particular drug or compound or device, is it reasonable, knowing that there are always going to be risk associated, but it's a benefit-risk ratio that changes depending on the disease and the type of drug that it is. So you can imagine if you're talking about getting approval, for example, for a new migraine trial, migraines can affect certainly quality of life, but there are a lot of compounds out there. Relatively speaking, there are some, fairly good treatments out there. The risk profile for a migraine compound would be vastly different than that, say, for an oncology, some type of cancer drug, or especially a rare disease where there's not another. So that safety profile, you can see, is kind of a relative measure. There are literally tens of thousands of clinical research professionals, technology professionals. There's a huge amount of manpower that makes this happen. So there's never one superstar. There's never one person who is going to be, the ultimate driver to a drug coming to the market. Yes, there are the discovery people from the very beginning, the scientists, but it literally takes an entire army of people involved in that. And we'll talk a little bit as we advance kind of about that ecosystem. I'm going to pause right here because I just want to make sure that the process is clear. Is there anybody in the audience that has any type of questions or clarification as far as the overall process? All right.
Just as in between phases, does any of those phases is going to determine the price or the cost of the drug at the end?
So the question was, just so everybody knows, the question is that along the way in the transition with the phases, are there any of these phases where it's being established the price of the drug? I think that along the way, certainly the insights that are being gathered during the phases shed some light on that. But I can tell you probably from a pricing standpoint, that is happening really as a separate function. So there's, a lot of market analysis and looking at disease cost. And at the end of the day, a lot of the pricing really does depend on ultimately the size of the market. So what can happen to a pharmaceutical company is you can get caught from a pharmaceutical company in terms of your projections, and it might be that one of your competitors is developing a very similar type of compound, and if that company gets to market first, it certainly would affect your market share. I have to say, though, on my side of the equation and in where I have always sat with respect to the clinical trial enterprise, I would say I'm a million miles away in some ways from the commercialization and the marketing people. So generally speaking, when you're talking about clinical research, you really are talking about more the scientists, and I would say really more healthcare professionals that are involved on this side of the equation. So I wanted to just give you some kind of simple facts about clinical research, and I actually see clinical research to be very, very connected to public health. We don't often talk about the correlation of research and public health, but they really do go hand in hand. So here are, some, I think, interesting facts. So through that process that I just described, and over the span of 12 to 14 years for a new compound to come to the market and ultimately be approved, at least in the United States, that approval time might be a little less in other countries, but in the United States, over that 12 to 14 years, on average, it's about $2.6 billion to bring the market. Now, thinking back to that slide on the 7,000 compounds and devices that are in development right now, if you were to go on to the government website of clinicaltrials.gov and you were to tally up all of the needed people to participate in clinical research to answer all these scientific questions across all these various trials, it would be 58 million people. My data is a couple of years dated. I don't think there have been any updates to this, but in 2016, it was estimated that only about 2 million people actually participated in clinical research. Again, it takes 12 upwards to even 14 years to get a drug to market. It's attributed that some of the time delays are directly linked to low participation rates. So again, just by a show of hands, has anybody in the audience ever actually been approached by a healthcare provider about being in a clinical trial. Okay, wow. That's better than the national average, because right now it's estimated that even for oncology patients, less than 5% of the U.S. oncology patient base participates in a clinical trial, and the overall general population is about less than 1%. So we have a really sophisticated clinical research community sitting right here, which is great news. Interestingly enough, and this data came from Tufts out of Boston a few years ago, but there was a survey conducted, I think, across about 4,500 people, and these people were queried about interest in participating in research. And 72% of people actually said that they would like to hear about clinical research opportunities from doctors. And I tell you, when that data came out, I use that, because over the years I've worked with a lot of doctors, and sometimes doctors who've never participated in research. It's very common for doctors to say, my patients would never be interested in research. So it's the power of data. Interestingly enough, only 3% of really healthcare providers, physicians, nurse practitioners, PAs, participate in research. Why is that? A number of root cause issues. We won't go, that could be a whole different conversation, but the complexity of the clinical trial process makes it very difficult. It's very burdensome for a practicing physician or a practicing provider to kind of interject this little sideline of research, because not only in the clinical research process do you have keen responsibility to patient safety, but you also are becoming really you're a scientist, so you're collecting data, and that data needs to be pristine in terms of the way that we're collecting it. So it's a very cumbersome, process. And then 54% of the providers, and this slide says investigators. Investigator is really a term for research physicians and research providers. We call them principal investigators. They can be one and the same. A doctor can also be a principal investigator or a sub-investigator. But 54% of investigators only conduct a single trial. So I think we have some, again, root cause issues, that just the complexity of the clinical trial, while on the surface and as a healthcare professional, you might think that this just very much looks like kind of a continuation of the practice of medicine. There are so many layers of regulation because it's an FDA-regulated process, and because we always have to remember that patients are research participants, and what we have to do to kind of protect and ensure as much safety as we possibly can, makes the process that much more challenging. But with every challenge, I like to think in terms of what does that really mean? I think it means some really tremendous opportunities. And I think the greatest opportunity is how we affect this big number. So this kind of gets back to the public health issue. So every day we have over 153,000 deaths, and of those, about 7,500 deaths are attributed to cancer-related disease. Yet we only have 5% of the patient population exposed to clinical research. So the good news is that we have a lot of really persistent people out there that continue to show up and very, very focused on making an impact. And tremendous strides have been made. I mean, if you look just at leukemia, when I was a child in fourth grade, one of my friends in fourth grade was diagnosed with leukemia. She was gone before the end of the school year. Today it's almost unheard of from a pediatric standpoint for kids to die from leukemia. So, this number in terms of effect and impact, I am a strong believer that with all the challenges, the opportunities, we will continue to chip away at some of these life-altering, life-ending diseases. So a little bit about just kind of the ecosystem with respect to research. When I first got into the field of research, sometimes, people, again, would think about, who is that person who was responsible for developing the drug. The reality is generally speaking, it's not one person. It's a huge team, and it continues to be a huge team. Research is really a team sport. So for those of you who might have an interest in clinical research, I think that's where it's really good to know something about yourself, because if you are naturally a person that you enjoy collaborating and you enjoy being part of a team, I can guarantee you this will be a very rewarding career for you, because there's just so much collaboration that continues to be necessary. But it's a very complex environment. So sometimes we just think of it as pharmaceutical companies that make this happen. And I like to always, really take myself back to that why. And why is it, that this is important? The why is the patient. And we all are. That term can be a little controversial. I always push back on it a little bit. There will be some people who say, well, it's really the research volunteer and it's really those research participants. I mean, in a way, we're all in this together, because at some point in time, we're all patients. We certainly all have friends and family who have been or will be patients. So really, the ecosystem is really there to support the patient. But it is complex. So from a career standpoint, I wanted to really kind of touch on this, because to pursue a career in clinical research, you don't only have to think about how do you make your way to a pharmaceutical company, or how do you make your way into a clinic working with a doctor in research. Or from a technology standpoint, I'm really interested in technology, but that's not what clinical research is all about. That's actually couldn't be the furthest thing from the truth. There's so many different dimensions to this field. So as far as some of the key players, I just wanted to kind of touch on that. The biopharmaceutical companies, again, some mega multi-billion dollar, some are in startup mode, not very well funded, have a great idea, have a prospective great product and solution, and everything in between. But the biopharmaceutical company, which can be a very broad term, is really the entity that has the product, if you think of it that way. And then within those companies, to the extent that those companies are managing the project as we are progressing through the various phases, can widely vary. So with that, a really important player for biopharmaceutical companies in terms of development and as a development partner are contract research organizations. And in the state of North Carolina, we have been very fortunate, and our own Nancy has been a driver in terms of, this sector. And so companies like what were formerly known as Quintiles, now IQVIA, headquartered in RTP, PPD, which is in Wilmington, Parexel, Syneos, so many different companies are actually headquartered or have major operations in North Carolina. In fact, there are more clinical research professionals in the state of North Carolina, as far as from a state standpoint, than anywhere else in the country. So this is a really important sector, and while we do have the presence of biopharmaceutical companies and many of these other players, the CRO sector, and as far as job creation and job need in this state, is immense. So contract research organizations are really there as an outsourced service provider to pharma. So if you've looked at or even thought about the career path in clinical research associates, clinical research monitors, those organizations largely employ that part of the workforce. Contract research organizations tend to not have direct contact with patients. They are really there to help more on the administrative function and some of the data support needs and quality assurance, checks and balances on behalf of pharmaceutical companies. Of course, the Food and Drug Administration has an important role in this. In particular, lately, I have been very encouraged. I am a huge fan of our current FDA commissioner. His name's Scott Gottlieb. Dr. Gottlieb has a really interesting background. He actually has a pretty strong business background, but he's a physician and he's a cancer survivor. And Dr. Gottlieb, in a fairly short period of time, is kind of shaking things up at FDA. So I think a lot of changes when we are thinking about kind of 21st century clinical trial and drug development. I think there are a lot of good foundational things that are being planted there. Of course, healthcare providers are a key to this. Working alongside the patients and facilitating connection into clinical trials. At the heart of it are the healthcare providers. Had we talked about this, had we been talking 10 years ago, I probably would have actually had this slide and it would have said physicians and investigators. But it is becoming more and more a team sport. There is an important role for physicians, but physicians, because of the complexity, really rely on a really robust team that supports them. So that function of clinical research coordinator, I would imagine maybe some of you who are interested in this field or even pursuing studies might be looking to fill some of those roles. The clinical research coordinator, which is where I started. My first job in research was as a clinical research coordinator. And sometimes I think that even though now I'm the CEO of Javara and I'm working on a nonprofit, and there are a lot of other things that are important to me, sometimes I think if I get really lucky, my last job will be a research coordinator. Because the research coordinator, I believe, is the heartbeat of the whole process. It's the research coordinator that really is connecting the dots, that's doing a good job of getting the data that's necessary for all these other entities, but ensuring that from a patient standpoint, that the patient is having an experience, and we can't say in research that they're going to have a good, necessarily therapeutic end result, but that the care that these patients are receiving and that the protection and that the patient really is well informed and is understanding of what they're doing, I think that role is really central. Admittedly biased, I know, because that's where I came from, but I'm still going to stand by that. Institutional review boards play a very important part to this as well. Institutional review boards are mandated through the Code of Federal Regulations. So it is very much a legislative, it's part of the checks and balances system. So for every clinical trial that's being conducted, there is an independent third party with very specific composition of scientific people, could be clergy people. The aim of the Institutional Review Board, that it's a group of independent people who are not going to have any connection to any type of commercialization, any type of monetary upside, and that can really look at a trial being conducted in a community to be harmonious with the values of that particular community, and to ensure that bad things don't happen like unfortunately happened long ago. Things like Tuskegee, there have been situations in the past when people have been exploited, and so it's a protective mechanism. And I have to say, you know, I've been involved in clinical research for a very long time. I've been involved in participating as a coordinator, being a research manager, ultimately being the CEO of a research company across about 7,500 clinical trials, working with probably 1,000 different physicians on some different level, probably involving trials that included 100 to 150,000 people. And I have to say that this Institutional Review Board function is a really important function, because along the way, knock on wood, we never had any really medical legal issues. So it is a structure and it is a process that works. Unfortunately, every once in a while, Dateline will run some horrific story or, atrocious things that are happening in some faraway place. But that is, I can tell you, vastly the exception than the rule. And that's been another part of kind of my journey that has been very, very satisfying. I think generally speaking, people who get drawn to clinical research tend to kind of be the people who really want to make the world a little bit better and tend to be a little more service oriented and see good value in that. So that's an important function. Technology is a growing opportunity. And so I think for people who have even a little bit of interest and bend towards data and technology and analytics, it's probably the fastest growing sector within the ecosystem for research. And we'll talk a little bit, I'll come back to that as far as some of the advances, but technology is a big one. And then other support services. So if you think about labs, again, LabCorp, within this region is a really important economic force for this region. I can tell you a lot of LabCorp's growth and a lot of LabCorp's kind of future growth is very much centered on supporting the clinical trials enterprise. So just thinking about kind of, again, 21st century and trends and breakthroughs, I just wanted to kind of highlight for you, I think, some of the kind of buzz, what's going on right now kind of at the heartbeat of clinical research. There is a movement, it's an exciting movement. In fact, we have a conference April 29th and 30th in Raleigh, and it's called Clinical Research as a Care Option. And at this conference, we anticipate there will be well over 100 people. We'll have a number of universities, Vanderbilt, Wake Forest will be there, Duke will be there, other health systems from across the country, CROs, pharmaceutical companies. But there is a movement about how we better address this public health crisis of how people have a hard time getting connected to clinical research. So there are a group of leaders from pharmaceutical companies and like I said, academic medical centers, technology companies, some clinical research kind of diehards that are really trying to work to think about how we orchestrate or kind of create a new architecture that better connects clinical trials with mainstream healthcare. So with an electronic health record, for example, if you as a patient have a condition, how we can best link potential clinical trials within your area that perhaps could flag you as a prospective qualified patient to at least kind of put that in front of your doctor or your healthcare provider. So I think that's an important one. And I can tell you with respect to my new company, some of the kind of business discussions that we are having are how can we take a system that might have 6 million patients and over 5 years, how can we actually have trials that engage 1%? Or 2% of that population, and really understanding from a health system standpoint where are the unmet needs of the patient population, and then how are we connecting right trial to the right patient at the right time, because right now it's very disconnected. Certainly at-home trials, otherwise known as virtual trials. I think just in the past 6 months, 16 new companies have surfaced in the field of virtual trials. So if you were to Google virtual trials, you will see that it's a growing business segment. And again, it's really the idea of bringing clinical trials to you, whether it's on your wearable or on your mobile device. Actually, companies like Google, their parent company Apple, and they've got a company called Verily, are really working on that right now, that would detect if for some reason you might have a heart murmur or an arrhythmia or something like that, you might actually get pinged that there's a clinical trial in your area. So a lot of big companies, small companies really working on, bringing people, not waiting for people to find trials, but for trials to find people. Personalized medicine, our own Wake Forest, is very committed to personalized medicine. Some of the work with the Institute for Regenerative Medicine and many others around the country. Genomics data, again, really getting much more granular in terms of some of your own personal characteristics. LabCorp is doing a lot of work in this area. One thing I'm going to share with you guys, I didn't realize this, but have any of you heard of 23andMe? Okay, so 23andMe, LabCorp actually has a dedicated building, and LabCorp in Burlington is one of 2 facilities in the country that processes 23andMe. So at the heart of it, there's a lot of data, and so without you even knowing, there are health systems and there are other people out there that are actively working to try to even get ahead of maybe some disease or biomarker that you might have that you don't even realize that you have. So I think that day will be coming that you might well get pinged that there's a trial opportunity for you and you've been identified as potentially a high-risk patient. Those days are here to some extent, and there's certainly more to come. Wearable devices, participant-centered research. There are just so many active areas. Patient advocacy is becoming a huge influencer in terms of drug development. So if you think about the disease of cystic fibrosis, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has over, let me get this right, I think it's about $5 billion of assets. And cystic fibrosis is working very closely now with a handful of pharmaceutical companies, one in particular, and they are majorly influencing the drug development for that particular disease. So things are happening. It doesn't always necessarily make the front page. Sometimes it does make the front page. But even just within the past year, I wanted to list out some of the really important breakthroughs. So, artificial cervical disc from a device standpoint was approved. We have a new nasal spray for migraine headaches, treatment of plaque psoriasis. So every year, believe it or not, when you start with that funnel of 7,000, it is actually converting into treatments that make a difference for people. So what can you do with this? I mean, certainly I would hope that I've planted some seeds for some of you to at least think about or be a little more curious about pursuing a career in clinical research. It's estimated right now that not only do we not have enough people participating in research, we don't have enough professionals participating in the field of clinical research. So it's estimated right now, it's kind of a wide estimate, but there are anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000 open jobs. And they're good jobs. They're very, very good jobs. Entry-level jobs lead to middle management jobs, lead to who knows what. So it's a really dynamic field, and there are a lot of different paths and aspects that you can take with that. Right here in our community, obviously the program here for SciTech I think is really, really important. And Wake Forest is launching a couple of master's programs in clinical research leadership. In the state, we have some really great programs. We have Campbell University, the University of North North Carolina at Wilmington, Durham Tech, just to name a few. So in the country, there are about 100 educational programs. But I would say in the state of North Carolina, we are doing more than our share, and I have high hopes that we will continue to contribute more and more to the pool of talent in this important field. And again, careers in clinical research, I would say when I started out in research, my focus was like this. I would encourage you to really think expansively. I mean, you might say, I am not interested in a clinical job. I don't want to be dealing with patients every day. Well, even if your thing is human resources, again, when you're talking about the needs of this talent pool, there are enormous opportunities even in the field of human resources that can allow you to be very specialized in terms of the specific talent pool needs that we have for that workforce. And beyond educational or making a career change, there are other ways that you can get involved. I would encourage everybody here to think about finding some type of registry to participate in clinical research. Go to clinicaltrials.gov. Just the more that you can educate yourself, whether it's for yourself in your own personal or professional curiosity, I promise you at some point in time, at very minimum, you're going to have a friend or a family member that might well have a need for research. So it's good to get ahead of that and kind of understand the resources. I've listed some other groups here too. There's an Association for Clinical Research Professionals. 13,000 clinical research professionals are part of that organization. There's certification that you can get as a certified clinical research professional. Sometimes that means more money. With some companies, it certainly is always an opportunity for advancement in terms of knowledge. Clinicaltrials.gov, like I said, some other advocacy groups. So just a few resources for you. And with that, I'm going to leave. I think we have just a few minutes, but I wanted to kind of open up if there are any additional questions. Yes.
How are the political issues or questions that may arise in the progression of a clinical trial, how are they maintained and managed?
I'm sorry.
So in doing a clinical trial, of course, there's ethical and political questions or issues that may arise. How are those maintained or managed?
So I think generally speaking, with respect to ethical, I can't speak really to political. I would say the political gatekeeper, I'm not sure about that. I think from a development standpoint and a regulatory standpoint, again, the governance comes from FDA. So the entire structure is really mandated by FDA. The institutional review boards, I think, are a really important part of the conscience of the clinical trial.
And you also mentioned that sometimes as a clinical researcher, you don't really have to participate in your own trial, but wouldn't your data and your observations and experiences be more effective and better prepared if you put yourself in that trial?
So
if you actually participated in your own trial?
So there are different types of trials. I mean, for the most part, what I showed as far as phase 1 through 3 trials, those trials do require that people are participating. Okay. You know you're participating, whether you're actually getting an active drug or you're getting a sugar pill, placebo, or you're in a control group. More and more, though, especially as far as after FDA approval, there are post-market surveillance trials. And in some of those trials, their data is being researched, but it's done so in a de-identified way.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Thank you. Excellent presentation, and of course, more questions, but we don't have enough time.
Well, I will be available afterwards.
Okay,
so,
very
yes,
good. Well,
yes.
you can elaborate later on after that, but in developing of medications and new treatments, it's very common to hear on television that the patient should ask the doctor if that drug is correct for me or not. So my question that I always wonder, because I don't really understand why is it that they ask me to ask my doctor if that brand new drug is adequate or good for me or not. So how that will influence then the development or the treatment or the physician to get involved in participating in prescribing that drug when you get more patients asking about it, because we get more commercialized on that sense. So I don't know what really the goal is for me as a patient having to know and ask about a particular brand new drug in the market on television.
Well, so going back to some of the facts, right? There are, I would say that generally speaking, there's a relatively low clinical research IQ, not in a disparaging way, but I think that even for practicing physicians, many practicing physicians might have been exposed to research for a very short period of time during their training, and maybe that was 5 years ago, or maybe that was 50 years ago. So I think that's one issue. I am a big believer, and that's why I had it on the slide, I'm a big believer in by the people for the people. And I think going back to the data from Tufts, I think that as an individual patient, you can, or healthcare consumer, you can start at least planting seeds and start that conversation with your healthcare provider. Because again, like I told you, over the years, I can't tell you how many physicians that I have worked with or have gone and started some clinical research conversation. They say, oh no, my patients would never want to do this. And I believe that that's a very old school approach. I mean, if you think about 10 years ago, even when you went to the doctor and you had lab work done, how many times did anybody even proactively offer you, lab results? Now we're changing right now, right? So it is about people becoming more educated and informed. So I would encourage, any of you to just plant the seeds. I mean, healthcare systems are, generally speaking, I think, thinking more and more and moving to action with respect to bringing clinical research in and supporting that, and giving really physicians and the entire kind of team more support to do that. So there's a health system in the Midwest right now, and for example, that health system across the board, 8% of their patients in that entire system last year participated in research. But it was a commitment that the administrators within that system about 10 years ago made. So, yeah. Did that answer your question? Great.
Jennifer, can you talk about the how and why of your nonprofit, Greater Gift?
So about 7 years ago, I founded a nonprofit called the Greater Gift. And so this always gets a little tricky, Nancy, because I'm going to try to really connect a lot of dots here. So as a clinical research coordinator, right, I firsthand have had a lot of experience with people. Here's kind of how the first conversation goes. You get somebody's name, or they call in, they respond to an ad, and you say, have you ever participated in a research study? Most people say, no, I haven't. So you start kind of going through a kind of almost give an ABC of what we talked about. Here's the process, and here's what this would mean, and this is what this study would be about. And so people, in my experience, come into clinical trials. They are research participants, so we don't know. We generally don't know. Trials are what are called double-blind, so you don't know if it's the active drug or placebo, or if it's this dose level or that dose level. So the unknown part of it is you can never tell somebody, be in a research study, trust me, it is going to help you. You can never say that. And if anybody ever tells you that, you need to leave quickly. So that can never happen. But patients, in my experience, research patients, walk away from trial participation, and usually it's been a good experience for them because while it can be very burdensome if you have diabetes, rather than seeing your doctor twice a year for your diabetes management, you might actually be going into a clinic 10 times. And so you're getting a lot of attention and a lot of care because, right, we're collecting a lot of data. And so generally speaking, people finish a trial and they feel really good about the experience. Generally speaking, yes, there are always a few exceptions, but generally speaking, people have a good experience. The bad thing about it is it's because it's such a long process. If you go into a trial when it's phase 2, it could be 7 years later before that drug gets approved. And you don't even know when it's approved. I would imagine that a lot of those people who were on the plaque psoriasis trials for the drug that was just approved have no idea today that that drug was approved. So there's a disconnect, right? And there's not an easy way to solve that. And then you don't know, generally speaking, when you come off of a trial, you'll think, hopefully, you think that was a pretty good experience, but you don't know what this really meant. Was I on the drug? Was I not on the drug? Sometimes you get that feedback. It might be a year later. Sometimes you never get that feedback. So that's a disconnect. So the idea behind Greater Gift was that if we created a mechanism that gives people an immediate positive reinforcer, something that is absolutely certain, because I just participated in this research study, then I know for sure, beyond a shadow of a doubt, at least one other human being is going to have benefit. So for Greater Gift, I describe it as a patient celebration program. So for every clinical trial participant with our participating healthcare systems and companies that participate and support it. So for every patient, when you participate in a clinical research study, you are given a certificate, kind of like, when you were on the soccer team and you participated. You're given a certificate and it says, thank you for being a medical hero. And without you, we wouldn't have medical advancements. And because you just participated in this trial, a vaccine is being donated in your honor through a global health organization. And that global health organization is called Gavi. They are largely funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I am super proud of the fact that over the past 7 years, we have donated 110,000 vaccines through Gavi, which is the equivalent of 110,000 thank yous to people who have participated. So hopefully it leaves a little more positive impression. Hopefully it elevates a little bit even the brand and the experience for patients. I'm really excited to share with you all. We are expanding the Greater Gift program in Winston-Salem, and we're actually starting in Winston-Salem because this is our home city. And together with our partnership with Wake Forest, we will be donating through the backpack program. So rather than just addressing vaccines in Africa, to children in need, we're actually bringing the program here locally to the benefit of children in this community. So thank you for asking.
Well, I'm Russ Reed, and I'm the director of the National Center for the Biotechnology Workforce, and I'm part of Economic and Workforce Development. That's my boss right there, Dr. Alan Murdoch. And I just want to thank Jennifer for a marvelous lecture. And I'm actually very, very happy today because this is how I started my career a long, long time ago. And one of the questions we always like to ask folks is it possible for me? And the answer is yes. I was actually mentored by a medical director at a pharmaceutical company, brought me along. I was a very young person, brought me along and taught me how to be a research associate. And it was a very fascinating job, and I loved it. And Jennifer, you did an outstanding lecture today. Can we have a big round of applause?
Thank you.
And so on behalf of the college and on behalf of our staff, our faculty, and our sponsors, the foundation, Also NC Bio, which is our trade organization here in North Carolina, and the North Carolina Biotechnology Center, and of course us at the National Center for Biotechnology Workforce. We have a small token of appreciation for you.
Thank you.
And I just love your team picture up there. I can see your team. So Jennifer, this is for you. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And just one note, I think Charles Carter might be in here from Campbell University. Charles, if you want to come forward, that'd be great. And we're going to take pictures, and if you want to meet the speaker, please come on down. That'd be great. Family's here, so let's take a family photo.
Thank you.